everybody who's tuned in. My name is Mark Varian. I'm one of the archaeologists at the Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, and I want to welcome you to tonight's webinar, one that I'm really excited to listen to because I'm going to learn a lot. It's titled Western Pawneeland, Oral Traditions, Archaeology, and Euro-American Accounts of Pawnees in the Front Range by Carlton Gover. I'm sorry, Carlton. And I want to thank Taylor Hasbrook, who's my colleague at Crow Canyon, who's doing all the behind the scenes work to make this webinar possible. First, a little logistics. As you see your screen, when Carlton brings up his PowerPoint, you can minimize the size of the talking heads and find that vertical bar and move it over to the right to minimize the size of the talking heads. And maximize the size of the images and the presentation that Carlton is showing. There is a live transcription that is going to be at the bottom of your screen. If you have trouble with that, you can text into the chat and Taylor will try to take care of it. And if you want to get rid of the transcription, I think she can tell you how to do that too. We really welcome questions about Carlton's presentation, and the best way to do that is there's a Q&A button, and you punch that and write your question in. We'll, for the most part, take those questions at the end of the talk. Although if there's something that feels like it needs to be answered right away, we can do that too. If you're having any trouble with the Zoom connection, you can head over to Crow Canyon's Facebook site, and we're live streaming there. Also, if you have to break away from part of this, or if there's parts that you really want to go back and hear again, we'll publish this presentation tomorrow on Crow Canyon's YouTube site at that address that you can see at the bottom of your screen. Probably most people tuned in tonight, we're up over 100 now, know about Crow Canyon, but some of you might not. We're a independent, not-for-profit research education institution located outside of the town of Cortez, Colorado. That's a picture of our campus with the iconic Sleeping Ute Mountain in the background. And our mission is to empower present and future generations by making the human past accessible and relevant through archaeological research, experiential education, and American Indian knowledge. And I really encourage you to check out Crow Canyon's website at crowcanyon.org. There is a lot of educational materials, and we publish all of our research on that website. Crow Canyon acknowledges the Pueblo, Ute, my talking heads are in the way, just a second, Paiute, Dene, which is Navajo and Hickory Apache people, on whose traditional homelands our institution sits and upon which we work and reside. Our mission-related work would not be possible without Indigenous people in the past, present, and future. So we respectfully recognize, honor ancestral and descendant Indigenous communities for their contributions to all kind. Crow Canyon is grateful to all Indigenous people and supports the preservation and protection of cultural traditions, ancestral connections, and sacred lands. We had a really generous board member who made a $50,000 challenge match in order to fund these webinars in 2021. So every dollar you contribute will be matched by this matching gift and support this Discover Archaeology webinar series. This slide was just created today. It's the most recent update, and you can see we're up to 27,487 of the match dollars. So we respectfully ask, if you're so inclined, when you register for the webinars, to please make a donation to help us reach this match. There's a couple, the webinars are every Thursday night, and the next two that are coming up are going to be excellent. Next Thursday on July 8th, one of my friends and colleagues from right here in Cortez, Ryan Spittler, will be making a presentation. Ryan works for one of the most prominent contract archaeology firms in the Four Corners and beyond, Woods Canyon Archaeological Consultants, and they've been doing really large-scale cultural inventories in southeast Utah near the Bears Ears National Monument area. So Ryan will be talking about what they found with that recent research. Then on July 15th, Christopher Schwartz will be presenting Scarlet Macaws, Long Distance Exchange, and Placemaking in the Pre-Hispanic U.S. Southwest and Mexican Northwest. It's really interesting, and I know I'm not going to miss either of those. The Pueblos and indigenous communities of the Four Corners, like all communities, have been hit hard by COVID, but there's ways that you can help by donating to these funds. The Pueblo Relief Fund, the Hopi Relief Fund, the Navajo and Hopi Families COVID Relief Fund, and the official Navajo Nation COVID-19 Relief Fund. You can go to those addresses, web addresses listed here in order to find out how you can help these communities as we pull out of the pandemic. This is another area where you might not have something to write these down with, and you can go to the YouTube page tomorrow and bring up this talk and have the time to find these addresses again so that you can contact these organizations. That brings us to our talk tonight. We're really excited. As I said, the title is Western Pawneeland, Oral Traditions, Archaeology, and Euro-American Accounts of Pawnees on the Front Range. Carlton Gover is a citizen of the Pawnee Nation of Oklahoma and is pursuing his PhD in anthropology with a subfield emphasis in archaeology from the University of Colorado, Boulder. He received his MA in anthropology from the University of Wyoming and his BS in anthropology from Radford University. His research utilizes Pawnee, Arikara, and Wichita oral traditions regarding population movement and social change as foundational evidence for interpreting the late pre-contact archaeological record. In addition to this work and being a graduate student, Carlton is also the board secretary for the Museum of the Pawnee Nation Board of Directors. He's also a host on the podcast, A Life in Ruins, which you should check out. He's also a research associate for the New Archaeological School, which is actually the English translation of a Ukraine name because this school is in Ukraine. Finally, he's on the Society for American Archaeology Committee on Native American Relations. So we're very pleased to have Carlton speak tonight about his ongoing research on Pawneeland. Carlton, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that introduction, Mark. Let me go ahead and get this ready to go. And I have two screens and we'll do that. So I need to change the displays. So hello, everyone. Can you all see me and hear me all right? Excellent. The transcription's running, so I'll just go ahead and say that. My name is Carlton Shield Chief Gover. Hello, everyone, and thank you for coming to tonight's presentation. I'm really glad to create a brand new presentation for 125 people that I haven't started yet. So we'll just see how this goes. I'm excited to be here. Thank you so much, Crow Canyon. And got to give photo credit to Crow Canyon intern Kelsey Hoppus for taking that photo that was used as the poster. So yeah, real quick, just a little bit about me. Mark's covered most of it, actually. I am also getting graduate certificates in Indigenous Studies and Museum Science, and I've done a lot here in Colorado and got several scholarships through Colorado organizations, such as the Ward Weekly Scholarship and the CCPA Native American Summer Research Scholarship. So I'm once again really excited. Additionally to my studies, I do, why is that not moving? Perfect. I'm a pretty avid science communicator. As Mark mentioned, I am one of 3 hosts of the Life in Ruins podcast, which I think gets over 5,500 downloads a month now. But for the Southwest crowd tonight, I had the pleasure of opening up a new podcast called Site Bites, and the first season is all about Chaco Canyon. My featured co-host is Rob Weiner, who's also given a talk here for Crow Canyon, and we've had guests such as Patrick Cruz, Paul Freeman, Rich Friedman, Paul Reed, Kathy Cameron, and Steve Lexon. And it's a really interesting deep dive into Chaco Canyon. So yeah, And before we begin, a huge thank you to those that have supported me academically through the past, like 6 years now. My advisors, Dr. Doug Bamforth, Dr. Eric Robinson, Casey Carlson. Huge shout out to the state archaeologist of Nebraska, Rob Bozell, the Pawnee Nation Tipo, Matt Reed, and of course, Roger Echohawk, whose research into Caddoan oral traditions has made everything possible for me to research. So really, without Roger's work, everything I'm talking about tonight wouldn't be possible. So I think he's in the crowd tonight. So hello, Roger and Linda. Once again, thank you guys so much for your continued support. So why this research, and how did my studies of Pawnees, Arikaras, or Wichitas, Caddoan speaking folks in general, in Colorado? And a lot of it deals with this background question I had years ago, which propelled me to go to graduate school. And that was long ago in my dad's 2003 Jeep Grand Cherokee, driving back to the reservation in Montana, just asking him where Pawnees came from. And he told me we were related to the Aztecs. And the reason for that, the Pawnee Nation, specifically the Skeety Band, are the only U.S. continental tribe to have practiced ritual sacrifice, human sacrifice. And so there was kind of this relationship between human sacrifice. Additionally, Robert Hall, in his book in the 80s, also makes kind of some of these correlations. So I was like, okay, cool, we're part of the Aztecs. But it wasn't until later in undergraduate at Radford University when I asked a Mesoamerican archaeologist and told them about the background, the origins of the Pawnee, right, with the Aztecs, that he's like, nah, dude, that's probably not possible. And this really was the catalyst for me to look at archaeology more seriously and try to find archaeological solutions or answers to Pawnee deep time. Where do we come from? What does archaeology tell us? And it turned out not much. And so this led me to my master's thesis. You can find that online. Also, there's a video of it. It was called Dating Apps in Archaeology. And so a lot of what I'm going to be talking about tonight is residual information that I've gained through my master's thesis and ongoing in my dissertation. And looking at oral traditions critically in archaeology is not as, especially North American archaeology, United States archaeology, isn't as prevalent as I wish it would be. And vice versa, archaeology isn't taken as seriously in Indian country as I also wish it would be. And this comes from, this colonial past of archaeology, particularly in the new archaeology prior to NAGPRA, where indigenous people weren't always necessarily, their oral traditions weren't taken seriously. You have pushback in Indian country about this. Red Earth, White Lies by Vine Deloria Jr. In more recent articles, we see Dr. Paulette Steeves producing articles called Clovis is Bogus, or Yvette Running Horse Collin, who talks about how horses never left. And they're not, in Indian country archaeology is still kind of being pushed away, and vice versa in North American archaeology. We've seen definitely within the past 2 decades, indigenous archaeology become a little bit more prevalent, but it's still oral traditions by indigenous people, especially that go back to deep time, still aren't being taken seriously. And before we really kind of dive into where Pawnees are in the Front Range and how do we see them archaeologically, what do the oral traditions say? Just a real quick, brief background on what we're talking about here, because I imagine talking to a bunch of Southwest archaeologists. So we have a couple divisions in the plains: the Northwestern Plains, Northeastern, Central, and Southern Plains. And more for tonight, we're going to be talking about really the Western Central Plains. So this is really the Colorado and Wyoming Front Range that extends out into Western Kansas and Nebraska. So this is kind of the culture area the geographic area that we're speaking to. And these are our cultural taxonomies. We have Paleo-Indian, Archaic, Woodland, and Plains Village, and Contact Colonial. Pretty easy. We don't have anything crazy like you guys do, where you have Basket Maker 2 and 3, but there's no Basket Maker 1. That one threw me for a loop for a while. Pretty standard. A lot of Plains taxonomy is really just borrowed, particularly from the Southeast cultural taxonomies. So I'll be using this slide to kind of point to where we're going to be in time. The Pawnees, we call ourselves the Chitiks, meaning the men of men. And you have the Sanish, who are the Arikara, or the people. You can see here on the map to your left where these nations are located. So number one up here, this is the Sanish or the Arikara. Number two, the Pawnee, Chitiks. And number three down here, these are the Wichitas or Creekeries. These are the Northern Caddoan speakers. Caddoan is a language group. It's fashioned after the Caddo proper. And the language is named Caddo because, of course, they're the first people that were given the name. In terms of what kind of settlement pattern we see with historic Pawnees, Arikaras, you're getting the large earth lodge towns. The Arikaras are putting them on bluffs over the Missouri River. Most of the time they're fortified. The Pawnees are really, they're not always fortified, the villages, but they sometimes are. And these villages are rather huge. And that's why I've said villages a couple of times now. I really prefer the term towns as we're kind of moving towards that. The Creekeries, they actually have these large domiciles, but instead of using earth, they're the grass lodges. So, if you look at the fence, the post pattern, they're pretty similar. The Wichitas down here are really using the grass, the Kichai, and a couple others. These are also some other Caddoan speakers. So these large earth lodge villages, this is what they kind of look like in the ground. They're always pointed to the southeast or east. There are some ceremonial and religious rationales behind that, but also there's some environmental ones, like where does cold air come from usually on the plains? Well, it's coming from the west, and you really don't want that blowing in your house. So you do have this marriage of there's ceremonial and reasons for it, religious reasons, but also there are some environmental. These are maize-based agricultural groups. I mean, really, when you get to a certain population on the plains, there's like two things you have to do, and that's hunt bison and grow corn, grown maize. Pawnees and Arikaras, you're talking about 2 biannual bison hunts, one in the winter, one in the summer. So you come back in the spring to plant at these huge villages, and then you come back in the fall to harvest, right? So this is kind of the dichotomy of what's going on. In terms of political structure, the Arikara, there's 18 to 42 bands. We really don't know how many because smallpox sucks. Each band had their own village, whereas the Pawnee, we have 4 bands. We have the Skidi, Kikahaki, Petahawidatas, and the Chowee. The latter 3, the Kikahaki, Petahawidatas, and the Chowee, these are what we call the South bands. And they made up, historically, 1 or 2 villages each, whereas each of the 13 to 17 clans of the Skidi made up their own village. So they're larger. There's some dialect differences between the Skidi and the South bands, but when I mean dialect differences, if you read Doug Parks, he really talks about dialects and how important they are. It actually boils down to one pronunciation. So it's not that big of a deal. And so it's very mutually understandable. Arikara and Skidi is also mutually understandable. And so there needs to be some reanalysis done. People have kind of blown out of proportion how critical the dialects are, but these are 2 mutually understandable political units and cultural groups. And they're really kind of like a spectrum in terms of culture, language, where you have South bands on one side, Arikara on the other, and Skidi are somewhere in the middle. And that also plays out geographically, where the Arikara to the north, the Skidi are in central Nebraska, and the South bands are in southern Nebraska, northern Kansas. And I love this quote because we're going to start really going into oral traditions of these groups. And this comes out of Roger Echo Hawk's 2008 book, 2018, Ancient Pawneeland. Long ago, in every city of Pawneeland, when night fell among the earth lodges and the camps, people would gather to tell stories. They would follow long hours of narrative, cinematic journeying. Every evening, distant stars would waft through the dark above storytellers of Pawneeland. And I love using oral traditions because they give you this coarse-grained approach to understanding the archaeological record. There are differences in how Indigenous people look at time, and that even varies by the nation you're working with, and even the clans and families within those. But these coarse grains approaches that are provided by oral traditions, they do have these nuggets of information in them that you can corroborate is the word I'm trying to say, corroborate with archaeological taxa. And specifically, if you've been looking at settlement patterns, that's a big one, and geographic locations. So funny enough, and this is, if you've read Roger's article from 2000 in American Antiquity, he talks about this, that there's these indigenous oral traditions that talk about peopling of the Americas up to 12,000 years ago. And if you believe in subscribe to something older than Clovis, even there, that there's this Arikara oral tradition about a time of giants and monsters where it was dark and cold, and that the Pawnees have one that talks about following the dragon's back and being in between these deep chasms and deep ravines. And it's like, okay, that sounds cool. Like it's just a story tale. Well, giants and monsters, what about Pleistocene megafauna, where the animals are much larger than they are in historic times? Bison antiquus, latifrons, the mammoths, giant sloths. Are these the monsters and giants that they're talking about, that have held over from the Pleistocene, in which the people that came to the Americas lived at a time where the beasts were larger? And also the time of darkness and cold, still looking at that Pleistocene, right? It's the Ice Age, the end of the Ice Age. It's cold and wet. The dragon's back, this is a stretch, don't get me wrong, but as you're coming out of the ice-free corridor, is this the Rocky Mountains they're looking at? Especially right when they're pulled up in, when the mountains are held up in glaciers, but still the largest peaks are poking out of the glaciers, right? They could possibly look like spines. And this might be a stretch for some, but when you combine all these together, they're just trying to make sense of the environment around them. And as they're telling these stories, they don't have ice core modeling. They don't have the science and data that we do now. These are people trying to make sense of the world back then. And in terms of the deep chasms, deep ravines, like some of these glaciers, the ice-free corridor, those glaciers are up to like a mile tall. That's a pretty deep chasm, right? So that's why I really think, in particular, when you look at these different interpretations of how people got here, definitely, giants, monsters, if we're talking about corridors and dragon's back, it's probably not the oceanic colonization, which we have very little evidence for. It's definitely not Solutrean, and that's a whole other box of like can of worms I'm not getting into. It's most likely what I'm thinking of is the ice-free corridor. Excellent. And not the maritime route. So that's why I'm really thinking that these oral traditions, and I ascribe to, like, this isn't really my thought. This is I have to give this to Roger. Roger was thinking about this back 21 years ago. We're talking about Clovis, that this oral tradition itself dates back to Clovis, and more particularly, right, coming out of the Front Range somewhere, which would include Colorado, Wyoming, who knows exactly where. But this is an oral tradition that I believe and others believe that can go back to the Paleo-Indian period, 12,000 years ago. Boom. So we're going to make a really big stretch here. So we're going to go from 10,000 years ago to about 1,000. And the reason being is really, the Pawnee Nation and other plains villages, you're talking about populations before European colonization, numbered in the tens of thousands, to the Pawnee Nation dwindled down to like 350 people at the end of the 19th century. So we've lost some data. And also there are some, our oral traditions don't use the cultural taxa that we use in archaeology, or even the geographic features. When I agreed to this talk and wanted to make something that was specific to Colorado, I was going back through all of my old Pawnee books and notes, and There's in the glossary not a single reference to Colorado. However, there are references to those distant rocks or some of these other Pawnee names on the landscape that tie into the Front Range. But we really can start seeing a lot of oral traditions that are talking about what we would call the Plains Village period, or even late woodland. In the Plains Village, we were talking about early, about 1000 to 1300, the middle, 1300 to 1500, late, which is this contact colonial era, from 1500 to the late 19th century. Okay. And more specifically, there's one that talks about the formation of the Skeety Federation, where all the clans came together. This oral tradition talks about geography, Beaver Creek, also known as Wild Lisher's Creek, near Genoa. And before the Federation, before all closed man brought all these people together, it mentions that the people lived in scattered hamlets with square-shaped structures. And then afterwards, they adopted circular earth lodges. That's something that you can look at in the archaeological record. So how do we see this? What happens even before this? Well, leading up to this period, prior to the closed man story, there are, if you pull the Wichita, Arikara, and Pawnee stories on migration together, not only do all three nations talk about, oh, yes, we were related to one another, we came to Nebraska together, and then they diverged, but we'd had another journey together. And this is part of it. They talk, all three nations talk about how they came from the land of stone houses, somewhere in the Southwest. Is that Colorado? Is that New Mexico, Texas? We don't really know. But they traveled east. And at the cross of the Big Timbers, the Arikara here in blue, I'm really bad at Photoshop, so this is Microsoft Paint. Forgive me, I did my best. At the cross of the Big Timbers, the Arikara went north, whereas ancestral Pawnees and Wichitas continued going east until they came in contact with the Mississippi River, the Dark River. The Arikaras settled on the upper Republican River in northern Kansas, southern Nebraska. And as the Pawnees, ancestral Pawnees and Arikara or Wichitas were traveling north along the Dark River, the Skeeties Pawnees, ancestral Skeety Pawnees, branched off and went to go hang out with their Arikara relatives. They ended up displacing the Arikaras. So the Skeeties are now on the upper Republican, the Arikaras moved north, and then over time, and who knows how long this took, South Band Pawnees and Wichitas show up, they meet their friends, they all settle up somewhere. This is where the stories converge. The Pawnees talk about how the Wichitas stayed with them for a while, whereas the Wichitas say they got to Nebraska and pieced out and went back down to the southeast, so who really knows? But what we see here is this culture called Central Plains tradition. The first one to show up is this upper Republican, square houses, globular pottery, hamlets, and then we see Seed Kiskers show up. So we see this Central Plains tradition appear in areas in order that the Pawnees, Arikaras, and Wichitas talked about, in the geographic areas that they talked about. With the settlement patterning they talk about with the square houses, right? And these are a maize-based culture. So maybe they ran into Cahokia, who knows, Spyro, learned how to do some corn. In Seed Kisker phase in particular, you do see more Cahokian artifacts, whereas Upper Republican and Smoky Hill, you see more Spiroan. So there are some influences coming in, but they're all very much making the same houses, same settlement pattern. These are horticulturalists, so not full-blown maize yet. And this pretty homogeneous pottery. And this is about 1100 to 1400. And these are the core areas of what we would consider Central Plains tradition, but we see them elsewhere. We see them in particularly on the Front Range, that even though these are the core areas in central Nebraska and northern Kansas, there are these campsites along northeastern Colorado, southeastern Wyoming. In particular, so you see this globular pottery that is indicative of Central Plains culture showing up at these kill sites, But especially with in this part of Nebraska, there's not really good lithic raw material. You do find, Smoky Hill jasper down here. This Itzkari phase, which means Loop River and Skeety Pawnee, you find their pottery out here in southeastern Wyoming, and you're finding Hartville Uplift Chert coming out near Hell Gap in Guernsey back here. So they're coming out to hunt, and they're also getting raw material. So if you look at Itzkari lithics, a lot of them end up being Hartville Uplift from western Nebraska. And also you find a little bit of violence between these two groups. And in the western part of these campsites, there are these like buttes that are fortified against who? No idea. Maybe these ancestral Pawnees and Arikaras are not getting along with ancestral Shoshones. Who knows? But also in looking at this is kind of typical Central Plains tradition behavior. The Dismal River stuff, which is ancestral Apache, doesn't show up. There's really everywhere out here, southeast and east and northeast of Central Plains tradition, these are still small populations practicing late woodland hunting and gathering that are interacting with these horticulturalists. But interestingly enough, this is like kind of the core campsites. There's Central Plains tradition down near Pueblo, which is nuts. This is not something I really looked into, but down in Pueblo, Colorado, you find Central Plains tradition hamlets with Upper Republican pottery right next to Episcopa. And there's not much in between. Part of that might be just archaeological bias in terms of what we're collecting. There's not much private land. If you look in the High Plains campsites and stuff here, you do have, Pawnee Nation grasslands, Pawnee buttes, public land in southeastern Wyoming and western Nebraska. So that might just be a process of there's who knows what's out there, right? And moving on to what is out here, which is Episcopa. This is something that we're still looking into. It hasn't been excavated much. This Episcopa phase, this Episcopa focus is in the Episcopa Canyon in southeast Colorado, right actually next to this site here. That is this CPT site. Episcopa, some have argued that maybe Episcopa is that land of the stone houses from the oral tradition I talked earlier, but it's contemporaneous with Central Plains tradition, so it's not ancestral. So it's definitely not Episcopa as that land of stone houses. And the reason people think that is it looks really similar to Upper Republican Central Plains tradition in terms of the material culture and the agricultural practices, the horticulture, but it's stone slab architecture. So it's not these possibly, the Central Plains tradition pit house, probably wattle and daub, we're not sure. It used to be considered the panhandle culture, and I realized I misspelled that. But out here, this is where we're at. This is where this Episcopa phase is. It's not southwest, and they're also hanging out in fortified rock shelters up this canyon. And it looks really similar to Central Plains tradition, but, even looking at this map, this is really the heart of these campsites. And now we're seeing outside of Pueblo in these sites down here, Upper Republican. So maybe Central Plains tradition hunting camps, if they're following bison, right, which have these seasonal circular rounds, it's possible that Central Plains tradition goes down further than we thought. But it needs more investigations. One of Jason LaBelle's new graduate students at CSU, I think he's going to start exploring that, which we really need. Getting into further into time, or closer into time, going into the Plains Village pattern, we see a change from Central Plains tradition. If you guys are all kind of paying attention, around 1450s when we see this change, 1300, and that's the same time, right? If you're thinking about Mesa Verde and Chaco, things start to go cattywampus, and you have that medieval global warming period. And in the plains, we start seeing, like the red is the Skeety Pawnees, the black is the Wichita South Bands, blue is Arikara, the green representing the Wichita's leaving. there's a point where the oral traditions do talk about everyone hanging out together at the Missouri River, and this is where I kind of just stopped looking at the Wichitas because they were no longer relevant. And around this 1300 1500 period, we do have these severe droughts, and these horticulturalist cultures that rely on maize, you need water, right? And so these are the two big events where we see this transition in Plains culture. This is marking, the Dust Bowl. And this is where we see what we believe is to the beginnings of ethnogenesis of the Pawnees and Arikaras, or the Skeeties at least, and the Arikaras at the Lynch site in northeastern Nebraska. The site's over a mile long, and this is the work being conducted by Douglas Bamforth at CU Boulder, and this is the site itself. And this is happening around the 1200s, 1300s. So this is happening right before the end of the Central Plains tradition and beginning of the initial coalescence. So this is where we have the individuals now along the Missouri. And then we start seeing the diaspora of Northern Kanoan speakers. So the Wichitas are still somewhere in southern Kansas, Oklahoma. The Skeeties go into their historical range in central Nebraska. The South Bands go into their historical range in southern Nebraska, northern Kansas. Then the Arikara begin to travel up the Missouri River, which is where we get back to here, right? And this is this map to tribal territories that everyone thinks of, that you still see them in these ranges. However, what's disappointing about these maps, like the typical Plains Indian or tribal territories map, they're all maps of the 19th century, which is not necessarily accurate to pre-colonial home ranges, which is why I like this map a lot better. So you can see before, the Arapaho, Comanche, the Lakotas, and Sioux, Kiowas start showing up. This is the ranges of nations in 1650, really before colonial pressure really starts kicking in. So before the Arapahos come in, before the Comanches and Shoshones split, the Central Plains, the dominant group in between the Front Range and the Missouri River are Caddoan speakers. The Arikara up north, the Pawnee in the center, and then the Wichita, Tawakoni, Kichai, the Southern Plains. These groups are all now the part of the Wichita proper. The Wichita is like 7 affiliated tribes. And this territory still expands into the Front Range. There's still the core groups. If you look at the historic range, the core homeland of the Pawnee Nation is still central Nebraska and northern Kansas, but the hunting grounds still expand out west. And you can see that, and it is part of Pawnee geography. This is a map from Walter Echo Hawk's book, The Sea of Grass. Roger, his brother, helped him with this, or was the main source of information. And, this doesn't show the state boundaries, but here's the Front Range clearly, and here's the Missouri River. And in our cultural geography, you have Pawnee Buttes. You have mountain that touches the sky, Tuspay, which is Pikes Peak. Lady Free Inside at Spanish Peaks, the names for the rivers. And you can see the Pawnee Reservation 1876. We had one prior to that up here, but U.S. government politics. So even as a historic or proto-colonial or time period, this is our world. It extends from the Missouri River into the Front Range. And there are especially European accounts, right? So if we get into one of the major early ones are the Spanish incursions from the 1540, right? This isn't accurate. The Cheyenne haven't come down yet. The Apache are here, but the Comanche aren't. And these early differences, the Pawnees and the Otos are the reason why the Spanish didn't get out of the Southwest, fundamentally. I think it was like 600 something Spanish auxiliaries that were Apaches and Pueblos went out with like 100 conquistadors and got whomped in Kansas or Nebraska for the Villisur. So Coronado came out, he got whomped in Kansas by Pawnees, and then Villisur in 1720 went out and he got whomped in Nebraska. And it's always been kind of portrayed as this Spanish versus French with Indian allies. Well, the Europeans weren't really there. And this is the Villisur hide painting. It's like 6 bison hides long. If you go into the New Mexico History Museum in Santa Fe, you can see it. They have an exposition on it showing the Spanish getting absolutely wrecked by the Pawnees and Otos. And it's really it's really not a European conflict. Really, if you look at it, it's Apaches and Pawnees and Otos not getting along. Particularly, the Pawnees were raiding Apaches in the Front Range and northeastern New Mexico to sell Indian slaves to the French, and the Apaches are raiding Pawnee, Osage, and Oto villages to sell Indian slaves to the Spanish. And it changes the context when you talk about some of these early conflicts on the plains, the Front Range in between the Missouris. It's really indigenous nations keying into European conflict for their own benefit. And it's something that should be talked about more, that there are indigenous nations that actively participated in the indigenous slave trade. Does it make it right? Absolutely not. And I'm sure if Fox News heard me talking about this, they'd use that soundbite to their advantage. But it's the truth, and it's something that we should be talked about more. And this was occurring, in the Spanish territories along this area, right, where these groups were raiding each other. Moving more into the 19th century and really kind of tying in some of these Pawnee relationships. The Pawnee Nation has always been allied to the United States. We had a reservation outside, I think like east of Dennebrog here. And we ceded a lot of territory to the U.S. and the Lakota, who we do not get along with or didn't get along with, had a lot of free reign around our hunting grounds. And there was a lot of tribal animosity because you have to remember, before Euro-Americans really started playing pressure onto the Pawnees, there were indigenous groups moving out west in response and not getting along with the original inhabitants of the plains, which are the Plains Village tribes: Mandan, Hidatsas, Pawnees, Poncas, Omahas. Like, the people that grew corn have really kind of been on the plains longest. The horse nomads came later. And this culminates, especially in the Indian Wars, to the Pawnee Scouts, in which the United States military enlisted hundreds of Pawnees at various times to lead the United States cavalry to hunt down Cheyennes, Lakotas, and Arapahos, the recent traditional enemies of the Pawnee. And in these stories themselves, so hashtag Pawnees won the Indian Wars. For the Powder River or Summit Springs, you're talking about 200 Pawnee Scouts. Powder River, I think you're talking about 100. And there are these scout stories, and this is all in War Party in Blue by Mark Vanderloog. Pawnees became scouts, one, because being on the reservation sucked. And we come from a Huduska society. Pawnee Nation is very much a warrior society, and it was a way for young men to get war honors in a time of either being, in the Summit Springs, I think we're still in the reservation in Nebraska by the Powder River campaign. Now we're in Indian Territory in Oklahoma. But as the scouts are leading the U.S. cavalry into Wyoming and Colorado and Montana, older scouts would take a bunch of younger scouts and just tell Frank and Luther North, and then the North brothers, who were the white officers, we're gonna just go hunt. But in reality, what these older scouts were doing, were taking the younger scouts across Colorado and Wyoming on these hunting trips to show them ancestral places and places of power, some of which I talked earlier when looking at Colorado geography, and other places I don't have permission to talk about. And so there's this memory that's talked about in oral traditions that pops up several times. You see it really in the Villisur and Coronado expeditions, but also during the 19th century, even well after, 60, 70 years after the Pawnees moved to reservations, there's still the oral traditions of Pawnees being in the Front Range, because the Front Range really represents, if you compare these two maps, you really, the Western Plains, these are nomadic bison herders, and the Village Plains Indians are still hunting out here. Like, this isn't a firm boundary. Pawnees routinely went into Arapaho country to hunt. And Arapahos didn't, before, really the 1860s and the epidemics really took their tolls, Arapahos didn't mess, Cheyennes and Lakotas didn't mess with Pawnee hunting parties. Because you're talking about like a whole village of thousands of people emptying out into these running into small bands of Arapahos and Cheyennes. They just didn't mess with Pawnees. The Pawnees would come out, they would hunt, and they would leave. This historical dichotomy in Plains Indian warfare and what we think of Plains Indians and Plains Indian territories is really just an Indian Wars ontology of what we think of where Indians are. And why does this matter? Why is it important for me to be here for Crow Canyon to talk about, Pawnees in Colorado? Well, recently, Monday, Colorado universities, public universities, now have to give in-state tuition to the 48 known indigenous nations that were in Colorado. The Pawnee Nation is one of them. That's actually my cousin who's on the front of that. His name is Phil Gover. I just want to give him a shout out, and my niece, Delilah. But I didn't even know, as a Pawnee person, my nation's ancestry to Colorado, because we don't talk about it. We think of ourselves as Nebraska and Kansas Indians. And it wasn't really through my research and learning from Roger that I realized we had a pretty deep history in Colorado that spans until, like at least 950 CE. And many Pawnee individuals don't even know about a relationship to Colorado and southeastern Wyoming. That who I think of myself as an indigenous person, as a Pawnee person in particular, was restricted to a brief 44-decade period in the late 19th century. Whereas our history and our oral traditions, who our grandparents learned from, talk about our relationship to the Front Range, that we have sacred places that I drive by on the interstate all the time that I didn't know about it. Like even Garden of the Ancients, Garden of the Gods, we have a name for that. It's the Garden of the Evening Star. That is a very important place to us. And I've been there and not even recognized it. So part of me talking to you guys is, part of my abstract for this talk was everyone knows about the Utes, everyone knows about the Arapahos, everyone knows about the Pueblos, and today, as they should. But there are other nations. There are 48. Can anyone here actually name all 48? I can't even. But the Pawnees were one of them, and we've have a very large footprint here through time. And so I wanted to come today after the invite to spread this. And really promote the use of indigenous archaeology, or archaeologies, which is an approach for, by, and with indigenous people to interpret the archaeological record. And oral traditions are valuable to that. And you can collaborate, right? Through indigenous archaeology is a collaborative approach where you can work with descendant communities as equals from the beginning to end on understanding the past, right? And as an example, the Chop and Mason Museum Reservation Project, done by Steve Boulder, Crow Canyon, who's hosting this talk, does collaborative works, Mesa Verde National Parks. So it's important to incorporate oral traditions because you can learn things about these communities that you haven't even thought about before, and they kind of expand your knowledge of the past, right? One of the things, to be honest, that I kind of like about European archaeology is that it's history. And American archaeology can not even uncover, but, it could be a way for indigenous communities to give a historical approach to themselves, right? Rather than understanding human behavior, indigenous people don't care about that. They want to see who they are, right? And where they came from. To talk more about oral traditions that's not necessarily related to the Front Range, I have a bunch of talks, and you can basically see, because I gave a bunch of talks during COVID, how neurotic I am, because you can see how my bedroom changes over time. But they talk more, once again, my thesis I gave, that was for Colorado, the Council of the one of the Peaks chapters, Twin Peaks chapter of the Colorado Archaeological Society. And then I gave my thesis talk to the Pawnee Nation, which was the most terrifying talk I've ever given in my life. And they were all super appreciative of it. And all these are based on oral traditions. You can see how I use them and also tie them up in particular with Bayesian radiocarbon dates, which I find fascinating to provide chronologies. And then I have an upcoming edited volume called Digitizing Archaeology. 11 indigenous archaeologists from all over the country, from very different tribal backgrounds. And a lot of the research that's in this edited volume is based in oral traditions to provide that background and the foundations for the research. And it's written for TIPOs, NACPR officers, tribal archaeologists, and college students. It's not going to be very like academic. It is academic and peer reviewed, but it's meant to be a book that everyone can pick up. So, and hopefully for everyone listening, the Pawnee Nation Cultural Center is an up and coming project, and we hope to talk more like in our repository plans to have a lot of Colorado Pawnee stuff in Colorado that is being housed at DMNS and History of Colorado, and really use this as a place to educate and be a place where the cultural renaissance of the Pawnee Nation can really have a place to go. And part of that is to remind some of our younger citizens that we do have a home in Colorado and that we are Colorado Indians. So I really want to thank everyone for your time. If you have any questions I don't get to tonight, my email is carlton.gover@colorado.edu. So thank you very much, everybody. I hope this was informative, and I'd be happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Carlton. That was really excellent, and I really learned a lot from that talk. So there are a few questions, and perhaps some more will come in now that you've finished. But the first question that we got, it says a question for later. Dragons, winged serpents, or snakes are common in many cultural origin stories from different times and parts of the world. Do you have any thoughts about why that is?
Yes, Susan, there's actually a really great book called Monsters of Contact by Mark Vandelope, the same guy that did War Party in Blue, who looks at rock art that has serpents and monsters on it. And one of the more fascinating explanations I've seen that he talks about that in other places is that you find a lot of rock art that has like winged serpents and dragons and borderlands. And one interpretation could be is they're like putting up all these horrible things on their borders to scare people from coming into their territory. Like, oh, these things live here, these giant serpents, you shouldn't come here, you should stay away from giant serpent land. And I think it's fascinating to see a lot of these same stories of serpents, winged beasts, monsters across the globe, which might be speaking to maybe a time in our Australopithecine brains that we were trying to make sense of our world back then. But yeah, I'd highly recommend looking at Monsters of Contact as a something that could probably lead you in that direction.
Thank you. And the next question we got is there any evidence of the Plains tradition peoples coming into contact with the town currently being excavated near Arkansas City, Kansas?
I think that's that Wichita village at Sonoa. Is it at Sonoa?
Yeah,
that's being excavated by Don Blakesley. Yeah. I think Central Plains tradition precedes that. Like that's a Wichita city, and then that comes right afterwards. And we're pretty sure that some of the more southern geographic expressions of CPT are ancestral Wichita. But you do see that at Sonoa, Etowah, and they are trading with and interacting with South Band Pawnees as Skeeties are interacting with the Arikaras. So yeah, there's still, even though we have these distinct nations, Northern Condoans by and large are still interacting with each other on a regular basis.
Yeah, I don't know that archaeology really well, but I think it's the same site that professor at CU, Scott Ortman, who's on your committee, worked at that site one summer with the professor from Wichita State University. So that's really interesting. So I got a question. Where is the Pawnee Nation Cultural Center? Where will it be located, and when will it be open?
So the Pawnee Nation Cultural Center, right now there's a Pawnee Nation Museum in Pawnee, Oklahoma. The Pawnee Nation Cultural Center is an upcoming building, which will also be in Pawnee, Oklahoma. When it will be open, we're not quite sure. We have the site. Right now, we are working on getting it built, and the tribe has COVID money set aside from the from the federal government to help build it, because it was a project beforehand. So we're hoping in the next 3 years, and it to be a pretty, we want it to be a rather progressive tribal cultural center. So we're hoping to have a pretty big archaeology aspect to it and do a lot of research.
That's great. That's exciting. Got a question going back to the notion that Pawnee oral tradition could go back to Paleo-Indian times. Does the Lindenmeyer site near Fort Collins appear in Pawnee oral history?
Not particularly that I know of, which I've been thinking about that a lot recently as I'm working for Steve Nash at DMNS at the moment on Jones Miller and some other Paleo-Indian bison kills. And it's something I've been thinking about, but not something I've looked into in depth. So it's possible I'm just haven't hit that kind of research quite yet. So that's like an ongoing thing that I really want to look into is really, at the beginning of that talk, I was like, we're going to start with the oral tradition from Clovis times, and we're going to fast forward 10,000 years. And I want to see if we can close that gap somehow.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. I was really, Roger Echo Hawk, who you've mentioned several times during your talk, published that article in American Antiquity and made a really eloquent argument that oral tradition connected that deep in time. And I was really impressed by that argument. Somebody says, pardon my ignorance, although it's not ignorance. And then they ask, is Apishapa a tribe, an ethnic group, or is it just the river?
So it is just a cultural taxonomic unit. I mean, it's something that we've ascribed to this group of buildings in this canyon. We don't know who they are ancestral to, or if they ran into problems and didn't pass on their genes. Current thinking is that they are ancestral to, or at least they contribute to some Caddoan speaking group, whether that's the Wichitas or South Bands. I'm leaning more towards they probably contributed to Wichitas, right? Because talking about populations in time, you're not, we're not talking about these discrete units that never interact with people. These populations that we know historically, even different clans could have different backgrounds. And so tonight I was really kind of talking about the main migration stories, kind of like the widely accepted version of who the Pawnees, Arikras, and Wichitas are. And there are some even differences between those tribes. So it's hard, and it can get a little confusing. But we pretty positive Apishapa becomes some sort of either Wichitas or South Band group later on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I got a question. How do the elders feel about the Pawnee young scholars interpreting oral history in an academic way?
That is an excellent question, Lynn. It is interesting, to say the least. I work closely with the Cultural Resources Division in Pawnee, Oklahoma, and I work closely with Roger Echo Hawk. And a lot of my research in particular is using the oral traditions that are already published and what I'm allowed to know, and corroborating it with the archaeological record. I haven't gone into anything way too religious or ceremonial, but I always get permission from the tribe to talk about what I can and what I can publish. Some of the more traditional elders are skeptical. However, I come from a family that's really involved, so they know me. So it's not like I'm an outsider that happens to be Pawnee. I've been a part of the community, so there is that aspect of trust that allows me access to things that otherwise I wouldn't be. And also I work on behalf of the tribe, not myself. And they have an understanding of that. So I haven't run into I haven't run into like a brick wall of being shut out. They'll tell me like, you can't talk about that. You don't need to know about that. But generally I do what the tribe kind of wants me to research. So.
Great. Thank you for sharing that.
Mhm.
I got a question. Do the Plains cultures have rock art sites that relate to oral traditions?
Yes, my colleague on the edited volume, Emily Van Alts, she's Lakota, and she looks at rock art research in the Northern Plains that talk about some very ceremonial things. We also, the Pawnee, have some rock art sites that have also been looked at by Don Blakesley, who does that with huge Wichita City, that have our creation story on them. Unfortunately, on the Central Plains, there's not many rock outcroppings that are good for rock art, and the ones that are on private property. But in Texas, and especially like the lower Pecos, I think in Texas has some amazing rock art that actually might be Aztec. Now that I think about it, but there are rock art sites, and all of them, in some way, shape, or form, largely actually have oral traditions. So,
Yeah, I was just in far west Texas looking at some of that rock art in April, and it's pretty phenomenal. The woman Carolyn Boyd links it to Huichol ethnography, which is one of the Uto-Aztecan speaking groups in Mexico, but that's a topic for another talk. I got a good question, and there's just a few more left. I'd like to keep doing them if you're up for it.
absolutely, I'm up for it.
Yep. George Bird Grinnell hunted with the Pawnee in 1872. Which band would that have been? And has any of his material on Pawnee been incorporated into the Pawnee Center or Pawnee Knowledge?
Yeah, I think it was one of the South bands. I'm not quite sure which one. I have the book back there somewhere. I believe it was one of the South bands. So we have, maybe a repository is the wrong word, and definitely not a library, but we do have a lot of that information from George Bird Grinnell, as well as Waldo Wadle, and others who did ethnographic work back in the 19th century. However, we have some different interpretations to him than, with any ethnographic work from the 19th and 20th centuries. There are some discrepancies and it basically boils down to is the tribes, there's some information the tribes didn't want to share, and so they might have given a false answer, but we know the correct answers. So we do appreciate George's work. I think Roger's done a lot of work with some of the original collections at the Smithsonian Institution. So yeah, no, we've incorporated it. He's great. We like him a lot. And it's a fun book.
Great. I'm not familiar with it, so that's something I can go back and learn from. We got 3 more questions and then we'll call it a night. Here's a good one. I'm surprised that with Pawnee connections with Garden of the Gods and Pikes Peak, there's not more contact with the Utes. What are your thoughts?
I don't know. This is the Garden of the Gods aspect is, or Evening Stars, the Garden of the Evening Star. It's a geographic place that's kind of mentioned and that I haven't looked into more fully, and as well as the relationship between ancestral Utes and ancestral Northern Cadoans. So I'm just not sure, and I just haven't looked into it. That's a fantastic question that I hope to research more as I expand. I really want to start. I don't want to be so insular on Cadoans. It's just because I'm a grad student. There's only so much I can do. But what I really, as a long-term research goal, is to begin to incorporate other nations, because they all give a piece of the story. Like the stuff I talked to you about tonight comes from Arapaho, or not Arapaho, Arikara, Pawnee, and Wichita, that they all kind of help each other out. And I want to expand that to the other nations who can fill in these pieces of the puzzle, right? There's this large oral tradition, mosaic of oral traditions that could answer these questions about at least provide a relative chronology. So I think that's important. And I do want to begin looking with Utes, but a part of that is building trust with communities. And to answer kind of Gina's, like I talk with the Wichita Tipo and the Arikara cultural folks as often I get their information as much as possible, because they are all professionals and they're busy, and it's hard to just get their dedicated time. And there's a trust building exercise to that.
Yes. So here's a great comment, and it's by someone who I don't know named Renia. It says, "Thank you for your information. I am Tipo, an enrolled citizen of the Cheyenne River Sioux tribe. Can I find the book We Come for Good online?
I don't know if it's online. I know it's a Florida Press book. I love that book immensely. If you contact Karen Brunso, who is the TIPO of the either Choctaw or Chickasaw, she has an edited chapter. Here's her name for you. You can reach out to her. She's one of the authors, and she would probably give you, at least point you in the right direction if it is online, but also maybe provide you a discounted, or show you where to find a discounted copy of it, because hardcover is a little expensive. But yeah, reach out to Karen. She's also TIPO, and she's awesome. And she's the chair of the SCA Committee on Native American Relations, and she's a fantastic human being.
That's great. Thank you. You kind of answered this one. I think it's our last official question. I think I have one or two for you myself. But are there references to Pawnee migration patterns in the oral traditions of other indigenous groups? And do you collaborate with other tribes in your work? So I think you spoke to that some already, but
yeah,
I'll let you wrap that one up again.
Yeah, so a lot of these oral traditions in particular do relate to more historical times. So they do talk about like when the horse nomads showed up. They do talk about when the Apaches appeared. Like there's these mentions of when these other groups do show up. Mostly they relate to violence. And with that collaboration, it's with other Caddoan speaking groups at the moment, and I do want to expand that, especially to some more of the other like Poncas, Omahas, Otos. I really do want to start working with them more, because they've also been in the Central Plains for a long period of time. So I think it'd just be fascinating to compare notes, if you will.
There's a number of comments in the chat. Taylor, I'm wondering if we can copy that chat and get it to Carlton, and he can maybe connect with these folks that have really interesting comments in the chat. Carlton, I wondered if linguists have isolated the location of the Proto-Caddoan language.
Yes, sir, they have. Doug Parks did that work. I'm still screen sharing, and we'll go to, there we go. Nope, there we go. Yeah, so these are kind of the dates based on glottochronology from Doug Parks, and also Swadesh and Weltfish's original 1955 glottochronology. So it dates the Pawnee Rick around 300 or 500, so somewhat relatively recent. And the language breakdown itself looks more like this. Also, I did this in Microsoft Paint.
I'm not seeing it.
1 second. Let me see. I'll share this screen here. That's probably why. So this is kind of the cladogram.
Oh, nice.
That's done by Parks. So this is kind of how it breaks down. And then we have the times here from different glottochronologies.
Nice.
So that really, Pawnee Caddo, like Caddo proper, glottochronology has its draws, definitely. But there has been that work back with Doug Parks, who's been a, Pawnee linguist scholar for a long time. So
I ask because I started my archaeological career on a field school in East Texas on a contact period Caddo site, and Caddo archaeology is big in East Texas. And
yeah.
So you mentioned earlier about the inception of agriculture by these Caddoan groups, and I'd be really interested in that. And it does, I think the earliest corn out there in East Texas is around 8,900, and then around 1,200 it really intensifies.
Yeah.
And so, and I'm pretty sure they think that maize came from the Southwest, which would be of real interest to me. And occasionally I get emails from colleagues in Texas that send me pictures of Pueblo sherds that are way out there on Caddo sites in East Texas.
Yeah.
So there is that connection. And I wonder about that being a stream for the movement of agriculture into the northern Caddoan groups as well.
Absolutely. And we do have oral traditions that talk about our Caddo relatives. We have
Yeah, that was going to be my question.
Yeah, and we do also have names for Spyro and Cahokia.
Mhm.
And, part of this, when I talked about coming up the rivers, there are Arikaras and Pawnees have these um, ceremonies in which they wrap up corn and send it down the Missouri River. So that way their relatives down south know they're still around.
Mhm.
And
Wow.
who's that speaking to? And it's like probably the Caddos, the Caddo propers. And there are the names of them as like the civilized people. And we think it's talking to these groups because there is that Caddoan occupation north to south, Rickeras, Pawnees, Wichita's, Caddos. Now that relationship wasn't always great, but for a couple hundred years, the Central Plains was a Caddoan homeland. Like that's who was there. Not many people were outside of that. And that's
And
something we want to look at more. I want to, there are these, we're starting to see more like cultural collaboration and interchange between groups again, between nations outside of just kind of the reservation systems that I want to take advantage of. Like there's these, we used to trade with the Omahas, Poncas, and Otos all the time in southeastern Nebraska. And there's a trading ground that is, I think now, it became one of the, most of the mountain man meetups are on Indian trading centers. And we're trying to bring that back, actually, is to bring all those Nebraska tribes back together and have like a dance and bring that relationship back that we've lost. So taking advantage of those, and we do have like the Pawnees, for example, we have a Wichita visitation every year, and we have an Arikara visitation. So we go visit our relatives that we used to do, and we want to try to do that with the Caddos. And that's just to be determined.
yeah, that's really interesting. Do you know when Arikara made it as far north as the Missouri, where Bismarck, North Dakota is today?
That was that was either like late 18th century or
Okay.
19th.
All
That
right.
they're getting that far up is a little more recent in time. They just
I
kind of
see.
kept going,
Uh-huh.
but they were still always hanging out with Skeetees, Pawnees. Like they were still
Wow.
doing that. Like during the Arikara War, back in when you think of what is that darn movie with Leonardo DiCaprio? When you think of that movie about that mountain man, afterwards, as the U.S. government was like chasing the Arikaras around, a lot of them went and just like hid in Skeety villages, and they didn't know the difference. And even like some Lakota groups didn't even really recognize the difference between Arikaras and Pawnees. I think it was a vowel change in one of their words, but they just kind of saw us as the same.
Mm-hmm.
Same language, same real, pottery got a little different, but same houses. So some groups didn't even recognize us as two distinct nations.
Wow. Somebody said it's Revenant is the movie. So
Revenant, yes.
Revenant. All right, Carlton, it's such a pleasure to have you speak to us tonight. I know I learned a lot, and we're really grateful that you took the time to put the presentation together and deliver it to all of us tonight, and look forward, hopefully, to collaboration in the future.
Absolutely. Thank you guys so much for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you everyone for your questions. And you can email me at, if I wasn't able to get to yours, I'll type it in the chat right here. If you have any questions, comments, concerns, suggestions, please send me an email.
That's
I'd
great.
be happy to get back to it. So thank you all very much.
So good luck with your research. I think I heard that you're going to be a doctor, and about May next year, you'll finish your program. And so the best of luck to you as you keep going down this path.
Yep. Thank you so much, Mark. And thank you, Taylor, for helping me get this all set up. I really appreciate you guys' time. And thank you everyone for coming tonight.